SCOTUS may offer Trump an exit from Liberation Day tariffs. Flint West reporting. Recent research suggests that roughly 96% of the cost of the 2025 Liberation Day tariffs was absorbed by United States importers and consumers, not foreign exporters. At the same time, job growth has slowed, unemployment has ticked modestly higher, growth forecasts have been revised downward, and consumer purchasing power has faced pressure from tariff-related price effects. While multiple factors influence these macro trends, the economic transmission channel from tariffs to higher costs and softer demand is both plausible and supported by several institutional analyses. Against this backdrop, a Supreme Court ruling that limits or overturns the executive authority behind the tariffs could function as a politically convenient off-ramp. Such a decision would allow tariff policy to unwind without requiring a direct reversal by the administration, potentially easing economic friction while preserving political positioning. In this scenario, the court does not merely adjudicate legality. It becomes a structural release valve for a policy whose cost-benefit balance remains contested. Pillar 1. Incidence. Tariffs were marketed as a foreign bill. The evidence indicates they were predominantly an American bill. Liberation Day tariffs were framed as a turning point, a reset in global trade relations, a signal that the United States would no longer tolerate structural imbalances. But the data tells a more complicated story. A study from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy analyzed shipment-level data covering more than 25 million shipment records worth nearly $4 trillion from January 2024 through November 2025. The conclusion was stark. Foreign exporters absorbed roughly 4% of the tariff burden. Americans absorbed roughly 96%. That finding challenges the central political narrative. The tariffs did not primarily transfer costs abroad. They functioned largely as a domestic cost shock, a tax-like burden distributed through importers, firms, and ultimately households. The Wall Street Journal reported the same finding in plain language. Americans are the ones paying. Pillar 2. Labor correlation. Tariffs correlate with softer hiring, particularly in import-exposed sectors, because rising costs and weakened demand compress expansion. Tariffs do not stop at the border. They move through a system. First, a tariff is imposed on an imported good. Second, if foreign exporters do not meaningfully cut prices, and the Kiel research suggests they did not beyond a small fraction, the cost remains within the United States economy. Third, domestic firms must decide whether to absorb the cost through reduced margins, pass it forward through higher prices, or implement a combination of both. Fourth, higher prices and tighter margins alter behavior. Consumers delay purchases, substitute cheaper alternatives, or reduce discretionary spending. Firms slow hiring, postpone investment, and conserve cash. Fifth, labor markets begin to cool, not necessarily through dramatic collapse, but through slower payroll growth, weaker hiring plans, and reduced momentum. This mechanism is not purely theoretical. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City examined tariff exposure and hiring patterns and concluded that tariffs may have created measurable headwinds to job growth in 2025. Their central estimate suggested that the economy could have added approximately 19,000 more jobs per month from January through August without direct tariff effects, and that unemployment might have been about 1/10 of 1 percentage point lower, while acknowledging uncertainty in macroeconomic attribution. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Pillar 3. Expectations. Tariffs can elevate inflation expectations and weaken consumer confidence when price pressures become visible in everyday goods. The third pillar addresses expectations. Even when tariffs do not generate permanent inflation, they can influence inflation psychology. Households respond to visible price changes. Survey data from the University of Michigan showed one-year inflation expectations rising from 3.3% to 4.3% in February 2025, alongside a deterioration in sentiment. When these pillars are considered together, a broader picture emerges. Americans bear the majority of the tariff burden. That burden can transmit into slower hiring through cost and demand channels. It can also shape expectations and confidence in ways that influence spending behavior. The question is not whether tariffs are the sole cause of economic cooling. Multiple forces operate simultaneously in any macro environment. The question is whether tariffs constitute a meaningful contributing factor. The available evidence indicates that such a contribution is plausible and supported across several institutional analyses, particularly in sectors most exposed to import dependence. The strategic dimension then becomes unavoidable. A policy can generate negotiating leverage and political signaling value while simultaneously producing domestic economic friction. Tariffs offer clear rhetorical strength. They communicate resolve. They project negotiation posture. They create identifiable external targets. However, if the cost-benefit balance begins to shift, if economic data shows persistent softness, if consumers feel price pressure, and if markets interpret tariffs as structural drag, the calculus changes. At that point, an institutional constraint can become politically useful. If the Supreme Court were to limit or overturn the executive authority underlying the tariffs, the policy could unwind without requiring a voluntary reversal. The administration could point to judicial limits rather than strategic retreat. Economic pressure could ease, while political positioning remains largely intact. In that context, the court serves not only as a constitutional arbiter, but as a systemic release valve. This is not an accusation. It is a structural observation. When policy outcomes diverge from projected benefits, institutional intervention can provide an exit that preserves narrative continuity. Liberation Day tariffs were framed as a foreign cost imposition. Empirical evidence indicates that the burden fell primarily at home. Economic correlations suggest measurable headwinds in labor and expectations, and legal uncertainty introduces a potential mechanism for policy recalibration without explicit reversal. That is the complete position as it stands. Flint West signing off.